WCW Starrcade 1997 was the biggest grossing pay-per-view in WCW history, drawing a huge 1.9 buy rate. This equates to about 800,000 fans purchasing the pay-per-view for $40. Wrestling fans were parting with their money to see the NWO's Hulk Hogan finally defend the WCW Championship against Sting. The plus 1 year build up to the match had worked, the fans had bought in, and it was time to deliver WCW's biggest pay-per-view main event. When Hulk Hogan body slammed Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, the stars aligned. When Hulk Hogan met Warrior in the ring at Mania 6, the stars aligned. When The Rock faced off against Hogan years later at WrestleMania 18, the stars aligned. So why did the stars not align when Hulk Hogan met Sting at WCW Starrcade 1997, even with having an arguably better build-up than all those previous matches combined? How did the surefire hit manage to fall so flat? A mixture of personal issues, a botched finish, and bad decisions turned what was supposed to be the biggest success in WCW's history into a pivotal point where we would begin to witness the downfall of the company. It all started with Sting vs Hogan at Starrcade 1997, and any good faith fans may have had in WCW was then quickly getting depleted by the company. About a year and a half before the Starrcade match took place, Hulk Hogan turned heel by joining Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in the New World Order. At Bash at the Beach 1996, Sting, Lex Luger and Randy Savage fell victim to the newly formed group when Hogan surprised the world and announced a new world order in professional wrestling. The NWO were portrayed as WWF invaders, and they were there to tear apart the tradition that was WCW and take over the company. To combat the NWO invasion, WCW stars who previously were feuding would need to come together to fight this new common enemy. Lex Luger and Sting approached their rivals Ric Flair and Arn Anderson of the Four Horsemen, and the men put aside their differences to form Team WCW, who would be marching into Fall Brawl 1996 to put a stop to the NWO. Team WCW would be facing Hall, Nash and Hogan in a War Games match, with the fourth member of the NWO team to be revealed later. On the WCW Monday Nitro episode, which aired before Fall Brawl, it appeared that Sting was actually the fourth member of Team NWO when he was seen attacking Lex Luger. This, however, was a trick played by the NWO. Sting was not at Monday Nitro that night, and the attacker was actually a fake Sting, portrayed by Jeff Farmer. The attack led to paranoia on Team WCW's side, with Lex Luger believing he was attacked by the real Sting. The War Games match got underway. Sting entered as the fourth and final man for Team WCW after the imposter Sting had entered for the NWO. Once in the ring, Sting immediately took out all four members of the NWO. He then stopped, turned to Lex Luger and said to him, "Is that good enough for you right there? Is that proof enough?" Sting then walked out of the match, leaving Team WCW at a 4-on-3 disadvantage, which they did not overcome. The next night on Nitro, Sting talked about how he was upset that Lex Luger ever doubted him. Along with this, Sting said, "I've carried the WCW banner and I have given my blood, my sweat and my tears for WCW. For all those fans out there and all those wrestlers and people that ever doubted the Stinger, I'll stand by you if you stand by me. But for all of the people, all of the commentators, all of the wrestlers and all of the best friends who did doubt me, you can stick it. From now on, I consider myself a free agent." Sting left the ring and worked a few matches with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Upon his WCW return on the October 21st, 1996 edition of WCW Nitro, Sting would have a drastic new look. Scott Hall was responsible for suggesting to Sting backstage that he should consider changing his gimmick to look more like Brandon Lee in the Crow movie. It was a great suggestion from Hall, as the Crow gimmick for Sting worked perfectly for the character Sting was portraying at the time. After taking care of the fake Sting on this episode of Nitro, Sting uttered the most famous words of his career. "The only thing sure about Sting is nothing's for sure." Sting did not say another word for over a year. Eric Bischoff has since revealed that Sting was kind of living the Crow gimmick to a certain degree at the time. Quote Eric Bischoff, "The whole Crow angle began and the character just kind of showed up in the rafters. He didn't really talk and he didn't really engage with anybody. Well, that wasn't just the character, that was what was really going on with Steve Borden. He was almost like a ghost. He was very similar to his character, believe it or not. So what we didn't realise, what a lot of us didn't know, was just the depth of the personal issues that he was having in his life. It wasn't apparent to us." Hulk Hogan, meanwhile, was on fire as the top heel in WCW and arguably in all of professional wrestling. Hollywood Hogan would receive newfound popularity as a bad guy, and along with this came championship success. While the NWO was running roughshod in WCW, adding new members to the faction with Hogan in the driving seat, things were looking really good for the company. In the weeks and the months that followed, Sting would sit in the rafters at arenas, keeping a close eye on WCW and the NWO. At first we didn't know what Sting's intentions were, he would just watch as things unfolded. He would sometimes test the loyalty of WCW superstars, offering them the chance to hit him with his new trademark baseball bat. Normally the superstar wouldn't do it and thus gained Sting's approval. In the weeks leading up to WCW Uncensored in March of 1997, Sting would accompany the NWO to ringside, and it was strongly teased that the NWO had finally secured the services of Sting. This, however, was all a ruse. At the Uncensored pay-per-view, Sting descended from the rafters, baseball bat in hand, and took out the NWO. It was on this night Sting made his intentions clear. After disposing of the New World Order, Sting pointed his baseball bat at the WCW World Heavyweight Champion, Hulk Hogan. The match though would take a further 9 months to happen, but this was all by design. The Sting vs Hogan build-up was a perfect storm. Between the anti-hero Sting and the cool factor of the NWO, WCW was destroying the WWF in the Monday night ratings. Eric Bischoff and WCW had a sure thing going, and they would make fans wait for the big payoff. Episodes of Nitro would frequently end with Sting taking out the NWO, or episodes would end in the middle of a brawl between the Stinger and the NWO, making fans want to tune in the following week to see exactly what happened. It was genius and it worked. This kind of long-term booking was never really seen in the Eric Bischoff WCW up until this point. It was paying off, but we still had to get to Starrcade 1997. WCW Commissioner J.J. Dillon tried many times to get Sting to return to wrestling by making contracts to fight various NWO members. Sting, however, did not accept any of the contracts, often tearing them up in Dillon's face. J.J. Dillon questioned Sting about who he wanted to face, and Sting made it clear that he wanted to face Hulk Hogan. Eventually Sting got his wish, and he and Hogan finally met in December at Starrcade for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It was in time for this incredibly long build-up to finally pay off. Although it was frequently said on any given night by Tony Schiavone, this really was the biggest night in WCW history coming up. First of all, let's briefly talk about the match before getting into the details. Sting and Hogan made normal entrances to the ring, so Sting didn't come down from the rafters or have any kind of special entrance. I think this was the first mistake. It wouldn't be fair to say that the match itself was poor, it was just passable. But passable for the biggest show in WCW history, along with this incredibly long build-up, just isn't good enough. Sting's in-ring abilities seemed limited. He just wasn't the same in the ring. One could argue that Sting was portraying his character through his in-ring movements and moveset, but this doesn't really make sense either, as in matches that followed, he was miles better. Sting also didn't verbally sell any moves, which may sound odd, but it's something you will notice now after watching this video. He is silent during the whole match. Again, this is him probably staying in character, but selling is such an important aspect of any wrestling match that it just seems odd. So the match continues. Hogan chokes Sting with his foot in the corner. He then nails the big boot on Sting. Hogan signals for the leg drop, which would no doubt end the match. Hogan hits the leg drop on Sting and makes the cover. 1, 2, 3. Hogan pins Sting. The ref counted as normal. Hogan wins. To the astonishment of the crowd, Hogan just pinned and defeated Sting clean. What just happened? Bret Hart then hit the ring and stops David Panzer from ringing the bell to end the match. Bret grabs the mic and says, "I said it was never going to happen again, and it's not going to happen again." This was in reference to the Montreal Screwjob that happened in the WWF just a month prior. But there was no Screwjob here. Hogan just defeated Sting clean. Bret then suggests that referee Nick Patrick just done a fast count on Sting, screwing him out of the title, but he didn't. Bret then becomes an impromptu referee after taking out Nick Patrick, throws Hogan back into the ring. Sting gets the Scorpion Deathlock on Hogan and Hogan submits. Bret asks for the bell to be rung, and Sting is now the WCW champion. So, in short, the match was scripted for shady referee Nick Patrick to perform a fast count on Sting, but for whatever reason, this didn't happen. This botch, intentional or not, made the remainder of the match confusing to everyone watching. If Patrick did do the fast count, it would have made better sense, but he didn't, and thus the main event of Starrcade 1997 turned into a giant mess. Sting was the champion when the show went off the air, but it was a tainted win. The story of what exactly happened in the main event of Starrcade 1997 has often been debated, and the real explanation is something we may never know. Several rumours and theories have been presented, and Bischoff even spoke in depth about the main event in his 83 Weeks podcast. The thing is, and this is a personal thing, I sometimes find it difficult to believe Eric Bischoff, even though his words should be final. He obviously knows way more than you and me about what went down that night, but Bischoff has been caught out on talking shit before. A common and popular theory back in the day was that Hogan bribed Nick Patrick. Sounds ridiculous, but this was out there. The theory was that Hollywood Hogan paid referee Nick Patrick a high sum of money to not fast count Sting as they had previously agreed to. The reason this is a popular theory is because it sounds like something Hogan would do. He was notorious for not putting opponents over clean. I believe Nick Patrick just botched it. Nick Patrick just had a moment and he forgot to do the fast count. Referees mess up all the time, and it's unfortunate that it had to happen right here in a match of this magnitude, but it still happens. Eric Bischoff has since revealed that the whole fast count and Bret Hart scenario was never meant to happen, and Sting was originally booked to go over clean and strong. Remember earlier how we talked about Sting's personal problems becoming reflected into his gimmick? Well, Eric Bischoff went into more details about this. According to Eric Bischoff, when Sting showed up at Starrcade 97 to go over the match with Hogan and Eric, he was a shell of himself. It was one of the first times Bischoff had seen Sting without his makeup apparently, which I find hard to believe, but this is what Eric said. And apparently Sting looked haggard, had not been taking care of himself, and had not been in the gym. Sting was also going through a lot of undisclosed personal problems. According to Eric's narrative, the Hogan main event was the absolute last thing on Sting's mind. You do need to remember though that Eric Bischoff's narrative regarding Starrcade 97 has changed over the years. However, the following quotes were his most recent recollections on his podcast. Quote Eric Bischoff: "The mythical character and the illusions that we had spent 16 to 17 months creating kind of dissipated halfway down the aisle. I agree with that, and actually, that's the same way that both Hulk and I felt earlier in the day. There was no preparation physically on Steve's part. He didn't even bother spending 20 minutes getting a spray tan, for crying out loud. And Hulk and I talked about it after the fact, long after the fact, certainly not in that moment, but I think we both recognised the same thing, that this guy that just walked into the room, Steve Borden, is a shell of the Steve Borden that we thought we were going to see, and it was almost shocking in a way. We knew what the finish we wanted was before we even got to the building, before we got on a plane. We knew about it months in advance. We knew we wanted Sting to go over. He had to go over strong. We had to end the story exactly the way the audience wanted it to end. The guy shows up like he just heard about the match 45 minutes ago. It tends to make you rethink your position. It's also very clear that no one will take the blame and hold their hands up about the match being a failure. Everyone, including us fans, blames somebody else. Eric recently blamed Sting for his lack of enthusiasm. We as fans tend to automatically blame Hulk Hogan due to his history of not putting people over clean. Everyone blames Nick Patrick for not performing the fast count, and Sting himself blames WCW management because, as he puts it, nobody knew what was happening moments before the match. Quote Sting, "I don't really know what happened that day. I'm not sure to this day. There were nerves and a lot of politics going on, so that made it even worse. There's still some level of confusion in the back as to what we're going to do. How are we going to end this match? We went into it believing one thing, and then suddenly there was trouble." Fans were confused and annoyed at the end of Starrcade 97, and the pay-per-view buy rate would never hit those heights again. The questionable ending to Starrcade didn't seem costly to WCW at the time, but all these years later, that moment would turn out to be the first sign of the dysfunction that would only get worse for WCW in the years that followed. There's no doubt that Eric Bischoff's decision to play the long game with Sting versus Hogan was a stroke of genius, but the payoff will be remembered in wrestling history as a massive blow to the success of WCW. For all the good that was done throughout 1997, the year ended on a bad and sour note for WCW.